The first snowflakes of December had just begun to dust the rooftops of Willow Creek Elementary, a picturesque school nestled in a small Midwest town. Inside the brightly decorated hallways, twinkling lights and garlands created a festive atmosphere, masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. For 11-year-old Amara Johnson, Christmas was her favorite time of year, a season of hope, love, and togetherness. But this year, her joy was shadowed by an incident that would shake the entire community. Amara was a confident, intelligent black girl with radiant curls that she adored. Her mother, Teresa, often styled her hair with pride, teaching her about their heritage and the beauty of her natural features. But for Mrs. Beecham, a long-tenured fifth-grade teacher, Amara's hair was not a celebration, it was a distraction. To Mrs. Beecham, traditions outside her narrow worldview were unruly, and Amara's vibrant confidence stood as a quiet rebellion against her ingrained biases. It was the last day before the Christmas break when the unthinkable happened. Amara had been coloring a winter landscape in art class when Mrs. Beecham called her to the front of the room. With sharp words about proper appearances, she produced a pair of scissors. The room fell silent as Amara froze in place, her classmates exchanging bewildered and fearful glances. "Let's make you look presentable for the holidays," Mrs. Beecham sneered. Before Amara could respond, the teacher's hands invaded her personal space, cutting a significant chunk of her hair. The shock rippled through the room, and Amara's bright eyes filled with tears. That evening, Teresa was shattered as she listened to her daughter's trembling voice recount the day's events. Anger surged within her, but so did determination. This wasn't just about Amara. It was about every child who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or oppressed. As Christmas lights twinkled outside, the Johnsons prepared for a fight, not just for justice, but to remind their community of the true spirit of the season: compassion, understanding, and change. Teresa Johnson sat at the kitchen table late into the night, her hands trembling as she smoothed the frayed ends of her daughter's hair. Amara sat quietly beside her, wrapped in a blanket, her usually vibrant personality dimmed. Teresa's mind raced with questions, her heart heavy with anger and sadness. How could a teacher, a person entrusted with shaping young minds, do something so cruel? After tucking Amara into bed, Teresa reached for her phone. The first call was to the school principal, Mr. Eldridge, who sounded caught off guard by the gravity of her report. "This is serious," he said, his voice faltering. "I'll need to investigate this further before taking any action." But Teresa wasn't willing to wait. The next morning, she took Amara to a local therapist who specialized in child trauma. The therapist, a kind black woman named Dr. Laverne Morris, listened intently as Amara described the incident. Her soft-spoken words revealed how deeply the experience had shaken her. "I felt small, like I didn't matter," Amara said, her voice cracking. Teresa clenched her fists but kept her composure. She knew that her response to this situation would set an example for her daughter. Dr. Morris encouraged Teresa to address the issue, not just at the school level, but also within the broader community. "This isn't just about Amara's experience," Dr. Morris said. "It's about ensuring no other child goes through something similar. Your voice matters." Teresa nodded, her resolve solidified. That evening, she posted on social media, recounting the incident in detail. Her post quickly gained traction, drawing support from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who were appalled by the teacher's actions. Hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #ProtectOurChildren began trending locally. At the school, the mood was tense. Mr. Eldridge called an emergency meeting with the staff, including Mrs. Beecham, who staunchly defended her actions. "I was merely enforcing discipline," she said coldly. "Children need to be presentable, especially during the holidays." The principal pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. He knew the situation was spiraling out of control, but the pressure from Teresa and the community left him no choice but to suspend Mrs. Beecham pending further investigation. Meanwhile, local news outlets picked up the story, and journalists began knocking on the Johnsons' door. Teresa stood in front of her Christmas tree as cameras captured her tearful plea for change. "This isn't about ruining anyone's career," she said. "It's about accountability. It's about teaching our children that they are valued, no matter how they look or where they come from." As the media coverage spread, offers of support poured in. A Black-owned law firm reached out to represent Teresa and Amara pro bono. Churches and community organizations planned a candlelight vigil to show solidarity. Yet, amid the growing support, there was also backlash. Some parents defended Mrs. Beecham, claiming she was being unfairly vilified. Teresa ignored the negativity, focusing instead on helping Amara heal. She spent hours each day with her daughter, celebrating her natural beauty through affirmations and stories of powerful Black women who had overcome adversity. But the hardest part was yet to come, confronting the school board. With the Christmas holiday fast approaching, the Johnsons prepared to stand before the town, their faith and determination tested like never before. The crisp December air bit at Teresa's cheeks as she and Amara walked hand in hand into the packed school board meeting. A throng of community members filled the auditorium, their voices a mix of supportive murmurs and hushed debates. On one side of the room, Teresa noticed familiar faces, neighbors, church members, and parents who stood with her. On the other, there were those who, like Mrs. Beecham, clung to outdated ideas of discipline and order, their expressions cold and judgmental. Amara clutched a small notebook, the edges frayed from her constant fiddling. She had decided to write a letter to the board, a quiet but powerful way of sharing her truth. Teresa had encouraged her, knowing that this act of courage could be a step toward reclaiming her voice. The meeting began with formalities, but tension filled the room as the topic of Mrs. Beecham's actions was introduced. The board chair, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses named Dr. Harris, adjusted his microphone and addressed the room. "We are here to discuss an incident that has deeply affected our community," he said gravely. "Before we begin, I want to remind everyone to remain respectful." The first speaker was Mrs. Beecham herself, who stood with an air of defiance. "I have been a teacher at Willow Creek Elementary for over 20 years, she began. "My record speaks for itself. I acted in what I believed to be the best interest of the child in the class." Her words were met with a mix of applause from her supporters and murmurs of disbelief from others. Teresa bit her lip, her patience wearing thin. Next, it was Teresa's turn. She rose, holding a folder of evidence, photos of Amara's hair, her social media post, and statements from supportive parents. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shone with emotion. "My daughter was humiliated in front of her peers," she began. "This wasn't discipline. It was an assault on her identity, a message that she wasn't good enough as she was. That's not the kind of message any child should receive, especially in a place meant to nurture and protect them." As Teresa spoke, the room fell silent. Amara watched her mother with wide eyes, feeling both proud and inspired. Finally, Dr. Harris invited Amara to speak. Teresa gave her daughter a reassuring nod, and Amara approached the microphone with trembling hands. She opened her notebook and began to read. "I loved going to school because I felt like I could be myself," she said, her voice small but steady. "But that changed when my teacher told me that the way I looked was wrong. It made me feel like I didn't belong." Tears streamed down Amara's face as she continued, and the audience listened intently. Her vulnerability struck a chord with many in the room. When Amara finished, a ripple of applause broke out, growing louder until even some of Mrs. Beecham's supporters joined in. Mrs. Beecham herself remained stone-faced, but Teresa saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. The meeting ended with Dr. Harris promising a thorough investigation and a public statement before the holiday break. While it wasn't an immediate resolution, Teresa felt a small victory in the air. The courage it had taken Amara to speak had shifted the room's energy, opening hearts and minds in ways Teresa hadn't expected. That night, as the Johnsons drove home, they saw a group of neighbors standing outside their house, holding candles. The light of the vigil reflected on Amara's face, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Teresa hugged her daughter tightly, whispering, "We're going to get through this together." But deep down, Teresa knew the fight wasn't over. With Christmas just days away, the family's faith and unity would be tested again, as unseen challenges began to loom on the horizon. It was the morning of Christmas Eve when Teresa received a call that stopped her in her tracks. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast while Amara decorated gingerbread cookies at the table. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, but curiosity nudged her to answer. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Cheryl Goodman," the voice said. "I'm a former teacher at Willow Creek Elementary. I saw your story on the news, and I felt I needed to reach out." Teresa stepped into the living room, her heart racing. "What is this about?" There was a pause before Cheryl spoke again, her voice filled with hesitation. "I used to work with Mrs. Beecham. I left the school because of her. She's done things like this before, targeting children she doesn't think fit. I reported her to the administration, but nothing came of it. I thought you should know." Teresa sank onto the couch, stunned. "Why hasn't anyone spoken up about this?" "Because she's protected," Cheryl replied bitterly. "She's been at that school for decades, and the board turns a blind eye to her behavior. I'm willing to testify if it comes to that, but I wanted you to be prepared. This won't be an easy fight." As Teresa ended the call, a mix of anger and determination surged through her. She now had evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. But she also understood the challenge ahead, confronting not just a single teacher, but a system that had allowed such behavior to persist. Later that day, as Teresa shared the conversation with the attorney representing them, she received another shock. The attorney, a sharp and confident man named Marcus Cole, had uncovered additional troubling information. "Mrs. Beecham has been flagged in the past for disciplinary complaints," he said, "but every time, the complaints were quietly dismissed. It seems she has friends on the school board who've been protecting her." The revelation hit Teresa like a gut punch. The battle wasn't just about Mrs. Beecham, it was about dismantling a network of complicity that had enabled her actions for years. That evening, as the family prepared for the vigil at their local church, Teresa made a decision. She would no longer fight this battle quietly. With Cheryl Goodman's testimony and Marcus's findings, she planned to push for a full public investigation, even if it meant exposing uncomfortable truths about the town's leadership. At the vigil, surrounded by flickering candles in the warmth of their community, Amara spoke again. This time, her words carried a new confidence. "I want to thank everyone who's here tonight," she began. "Because of you, I feel like I'm not alone anymore. I know this isn't just about me, it's about making sure no one else feels the way I did." The crowd erupted into applause, and Teresa felt tears well up in her eyes. The support gave her strength, but she knew the fight was far from over. Christmas morning would bring a brief respite, but the days ahead promised more challenges, and perhaps even more shocking truths. As the snow began to fall that night, blanketing the town in silence, Teresa couldn't help but wonder, how deep did this corruption go, and how far would she have to go to bring justice to light? Christmas morning at the Johnson household was bittersweet. Despite the festive lights twinkling on the tree and the carefully wrapped presents waiting to be opened, there was a weight in the air that no carol could lift. Teresa tried to keep the day joyful for Amara, but her mind buzzed with thoughts of Cheryl Goodman's call and Marcus's finding. The family gathered around the table for breakfast, with Teresa and her sister, Nadine, exchanging knowing glances. Nadine, who had come to support them over the holidays, had always been a firebrand. "You know what you're up against, right?" Nadine said, breaking the silence as she sipped her coffee. "People who've been comfortable in their power don't give it up easily." Teresa nodded. "I know, but Cheryl is willing to testify, and Marcus has records. If we push this hard enough, they won't have a choice." Amara looked up from her plate, her voice hesitant. "What if they don't listen, Mom? What if they just make excuses like they always do?" Teresa knelt beside her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They might try, sweetheart, but we're not alone. This is bigger than us now, and sometimes change doesn't come easy. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what's right." Later that day, as the Johnsons visited the church for Christmas service, Teresa was approached by Pastor Miller, a warm and empathetic man who had known the family for years. "I've been hearing about what you're going through," he said gently. I want you to know that the church stands with you. We're planning a community forum to address what happened and to discuss ways we can do better as a town. Teresa felt a flicker of hope. Thank you, Pastor. It means so much to us to have this kind of support, but not everyone in the town was as understanding. As news of the investigation spread, Teresa began receiving anonymous messages, some supportive, but others filled with hostility. Stop trying to ruin a good teacher's career, one email read. Another warned, you'll regret this. The threats unsettled Teresa, but they only fueled her determination. She shared the messages with Marcus, who advised her to remain vigilant. We're making them uncomfortable, which means we're on the right track, he said. But be careful. People will do desperate things to protect their secrets. At the same time, Cheryl Goodman's involvement added a new layer of tension. As she prepared to testify, whispers spread that other former teachers might also come forward. Marcus began organizing their statements, uncovering a troubling pattern of bias and negligence that went far beyond Mrs. Beecham. Meanwhile, the school board was scrambling to contain the fallout. Dr. Harris issued a carefully worded statement to the local press, expressing deep concern over the allegations and promising a thorough review of policies. But Teresa wasn't convinced. It's damage control, she told Nadine as they read the statement together. They're trying to save face, not fix the problem. The turning point came 2 days later when Cheryl's testimony was leaked to the press. Her detailed account of Mrs. Beecham's past actions, including an incident where she berated a Native American student for speaking his native language, sent shockwaves through the town. The leak emboldened others to come forward. By the week's end, 3 more former teachers and even a few parents had shared their experiences, painting a picture of a deeply entrenched culture of discrimination at Willow Creek Elementary. As the evidence mounted, public opinion began to shift. The school board announced an emergency town hall meeting to address the growing outrage. For Teresa, it was a step in the right direction, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Amara, who had been watching her mother's tireless efforts, approached her one evening with a small, hesitant smile. "Mom," she said, holding up a sheet of paper, "I wrote something I want to read at the town hall." Teresa's heart swelled with pride. "Of course, baby. I'll be right there with you." As the town braced for the meeting, Teresa reflected on how far they had come. What had started as a moment of humiliation for Amara was becoming a catalyst for change, exposing not just one teacher, but an entire system that needed to be re-examined. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was their resolve. The night of the emergency town hall arrived, and the auditorium was packed to capacity. The air buzzed with tension as community members, parents, and even students took their seats. A podium stood at the center of the stage, flanked by members of the school board, including Dr. Harris. On the other side, a line of speakers awaited their turn, among them Teresa, Amara, and Cheryl Goodman. The Johnsons sat in the front row, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and supporters who had come to stand in solidarity. As Teresa scanned the crowd, she noticed Mrs. Beecham seated toward the back, her posture stiff and her face stony. Beside her sat a small group of supporters, their expressions a mixture of defiance and unease. The meeting opened with Dr. Harris delivering a carefully worded address. He emphasized the school board's commitment to creating an inclusive environment and announced a review of policies to ensure fairness and accountability. His tone was measured, but his words rang hollow to many in the audience. The first speaker was Cheryl Goodman. She recounted her experiences working under Mrs. Beecham and the culture of complicity she had witnessed. Her voice was steady, but filled with emotion, as she described the frustrations of being ignored by the administration. "I left teaching because I couldn't stand by and watch children be treated this way," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But now I realize leaving wasn't enough. Speaking out is the only way to ensure this stops." Cheryl's testimony was met with applause from most of the audience, but Teresa noticed a few members of the board exchanging uneasy glances. Next, several parents shared their own stories, detailing instances of subtle and overt bias their children had faced. One mother spoke of her son being disciplined for wearing a cultural garment, while another recounted her daughter's struggles with a curriculum that ignored her heritage. As the stories unfolded, a new challenge emerged, the realization that the problem extended far beyond Mrs. Beecham. While her actions had been the catalyst, it became clear that the school's policies and the attitudes of some staff had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. When it was Teresa's turn to speak, she walked to the podium with Amara by her side. The room fell silent as Teresa began, her voice strong but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about what happened to my daughter," she said. "It's about a system that failed her and so many others. My daughter was humiliated for being herself, and that's unacceptable. But what's even worse is that it's not an isolated incident. It's a pattern, and it needs to stop." Amara stepped forward, holding her handwritten note. Her small voice carried across the room, filled with a quiet strength that brought tears to many eyes. "I didn't feel like I belonged," she said, "but now I know that being different isn't bad. It's what makes me special. I hope no one else has to feel the way I did." As the applause erupted, Teresa felt a mix of pride and determination. But as she sat back down, she couldn't ignore the glare from Mrs. Beecham, whose supporters began whispering amongst themselves. The final twist of the evening came during the open Q&A session. A woman in the audience who introduced herself as Clara Smith stood up and addressed the board. "I've lived in this town for 50 years, she said, "and I've seen this kind of thing before. It's not just the schools, it's the way we've ignored these issues as a community. This isn't just about policies. It's about changing our mindset." Her words resonated with many, but also sparked murmurs of disagreement. The divisions within the town were becoming more apparent, with some members of the audience growing defensive. As the meeting ended, the Johnsons were surrounded by supporters offering words of encouragement. But as they left the building, Teresa overheard a group of Mrs. Beecham's allies muttering about filing a counter-complaint, accusing the Johnsons of defamation. The possibility of retaliation loomed large, adding a new layer of complexity to their fight. While they had made significant progress, it was clear that the road ahead would be filled with both victories and setbacks. In the days following the town hall, the atmosphere in Willow Creek grew increasingly tense. The story of the Johnsons' fight had spread beyond the town, drawing the attention of regional news outlets and civil rights organizations. For Teresa, the added attention was both a blessing and a burden. While it amplified the urgency of the issue, it also made her family the target of even more scrutiny and backlash. The first sign of trouble came when Teresa received a certified letter in the mail. It was from an attorney representing Mrs. Beecham, threatening a lawsuit for defamation. The letter accused Teresa of damaging the teacher's reputation through false and inflammatory statements. Teresa sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document, her hands trembling. "She's trying to scare us," she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. Nadine, sitting across from her, leaned forward. "And you're not going to let her, are you?" "No," Teresa said firmly, though the weight of the fight was starting to take its toll. Amara entered the room, her face clouded with concern. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" Teresa took a deep breath and reached for her daughter's hand. "No, baby, we're doing the right thing. Sometimes, when you stand up for yourself, people will try to make you feel like you're wrong. But we're not wrong. The defamation threat wasn't the only challenge." At school, Amara found herself caught in a web of conflicting emotions. Some of her classmates rallied around her, defending her against whispers and side glances. But others, especially those with parents who supported Mrs. Beecham, began to distance themselves. One afternoon during recess, Amara overheard two girls from her class whispering near the swings. "My mom says her mom is just trying to get money," one of them said. "That's dumb," the other replied. "Mrs. Beecham is mean anyway." Amara turned away, her chest tightening. She didn't want to cry, but the weight of being at the center of such a storm was overwhelming. She missed the days when school felt simple, when her biggest worry was finishing her homework on time. That evening, as Teresa braided Amara's hair, the little girl finally let her guard down. "Mom," she said softly, "why do some people hate us?" "I didn't do anything wrong." Teresa's heart ached at the question. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, she said. And instead of trying to learn, they choose to hate. But you are strong, Amara, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. Meanwhile, Teresa was grappling with her own emotional dilemmas. The defamation threat meant she needed to stay vigilant, and every step forward seemed to reveal more obstacles. The school board had announced a policy review, but no immediate action had been taken against Mrs. Beecham. At a strategy meeting with Marcus, Teresa's lawyer, and Cheryl Goodman, the frustration boiled over. "This isn't moving fast enough," Teresa said, pacing the room. "How many more meetings and statements do we need before they do something?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, his tone calm but firm. "It's a process, Teresa. The school board is stalling because they're trying to protect themselves. But the more evidence we collect, the harder it'll be for them to sweep this under the rug." Cheryl chimed in. "You're not just fighting for Amara, you're exposing years of neglect. That takes time," but time was running out for Teresa's patience. The pressure of being a public figure, the constant judgment from the town, and the emotional toll on Amara were wearing her down. That night, as she sat alone by the Christmas tree, she prayed for strength. "God," she whispered, "please give me the wisdom to see this through. I don't want to fail my daughter or anyone else who's counting on me." Her moment of reflection was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Pastor Miller, holding a folder of documents. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. "Some of the church members have been digging into the school's budget records. We found something interesting." Teresa opened the folder and scanned the pages. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were discrepancies in the school's financial records, missing funds, unexplained expenses, and grants allocated for diversity programs that had seemingly vanished. "This could be the leverage we need," Pastor Miller said. Teresa nodded, a new sense of determination rising within her. The fight had taken an unexpected turn, and while the challenges were mounting, so were the opportunities to expose the truth. The discovery of the school's financial discrepancies sent shockwaves through Teresa's small team. Late into the night, she, Pastor Miller, Marcus, and Cheryl Goodman pored over the documents at her dining room table. The numbers painted a damning picture. Grants designated for diversity training and anti-discrimination programs had been misused or worse, completely unaccounted for. "This isn't just negligence," Marcus said, his sharp eyes scanning the spreadsheets. "This looks deliberate." Cheryl nodded in agreement. "And it explains why they've been so resistant to change. If the board's complicit in this, exposing Mrs. Beecham might unravel everything." The revelation added a new dimension to the fight. It wasn't just about Amara or even Mrs. Beecham anymore. It was about uncovering systemic corruption that had allowed injustice to thrive unchecked. But as Teresa prepared to present this evidence, the resistance against her efforts escalated. Anonymous letters began arriving at her door, filled with veiled threats and accusations that she was tearing the town apart. One even warned her to drop it before things get worse. Teresa handed the letters to Marcus, who forwarded them to the police, but the fear lingered. Every shadow outside her window felt ominous, and she began double-checking the locks on her doors each night. Amara, too, felt the weight of the growing tension. At school, she noticed the shift in her teachers' attitudes. While some showed quiet support, others seemed colder, more distant. In one particularly painful moment, her math teacher, a close friend of Mrs. Beecham, refused to call on her during class, pretending not to see her raised hand. "Mom," Amara said tearfully one afternoon, "why does it feel like I'm the bad guy?" "You're not, sweetheart," Teresa said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "You're the reason things are going to change. But sometimes when you stand up for what's right, people don't know how to handle it." As Teresa struggled to balance her daughter's needs with the fight ahead, Marcus uncovered another lead. In reviewing old board meeting minutes, he noticed repeated approvals for contracts with a company called Horizon Solutions. "This company is listed as providing diversity workshops," Marcus explained, "but from what I can tell, the workshops never happened." Teresa frowned. "Who owns the company?" Marcus hesitated, then showed her the paperwork. The name at the top sent a chill down her spine. "Arthur Harris." "Dr. Harris?" Teresa asked in disbelief. Marcus nodded grimly. The same. The chair of the school board. The discovery was explosive. If Dr. Harris was personally profiting from these sham contracts, it meant he had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Confronting him would require careful strategy and solid proof. As they planned their next steps, Teresa's allies began growing in number. Cheryl Goodman reached out to other former teachers, and several agreed to testify about their experiences. Local activists organized a rally to show solidarity with the Johnsons, and a state-level civil rights group offered legal and financial support. But not everyone in the town was on their side. The backlash intensified as a small but vocal group of Mrs. Beecham's supporters organized their own campaign. They claimed Teresa was fabricating the allegations for attention and money, and even put up flyers around town accusing her of dividing the community. At one point, Nadine had to physically stop Teresa from tearing down the posters herself. "You can't let them drag you into the mud," she said. "We'll fight this with the truth." The breaking point came when a local news station requested an interview with Dr. Harris. In his carefully rehearsed statement, he denied any wrongdoing and framed the controversy as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. "This is a time for healing, not division," he said, his calm demeanor masking the growing storm. Teresa watched the interview with Marcus, her jaw tightening. "He's lying through his teeth," she said. "He is," Marcus agreed. "But we'll catch him." The numbers don't lie. As Christmas break came to a close, the tension in Willow Creek reached a boiling point. The next school board meeting promised to be a showdown, with both sides preparing to present their cases. For Teresa, it was a chance to shine a light on not just Mrs. Beecham's actions, but the corruption that had enabled her for so long. But as she reviewed her notes late one night, a sudden noise outside made her freeze. She crept to the window and saw a figure moving away from her porch. Opening the door, she found a smashed ornament from her Christmas display and a note scrawled in red marker, "Stay quiet. For your family's sake." Teresa's breath hitched as she clutched the note, her hands shaking. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had her resolve. This fight wasn't just for Amara. It was for every child who had ever been made to feel small, unworthy, or invisible. As the snow began to fall again, blanketing the town in eerie silence, Teresa knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The days leading up to the next school board meeting were a whirlwind of activity for Teresa and her growing circle of allies. The evidence against Dr. Harris and Mrs. Beecham was piling up, and the community was becoming more polarized. While many rallied behind the Johnsons, others grew defensive, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been unearthed. For Teresa, the personal toll was immense. Each morning, she found herself scanning the house for signs of tampering, double-checking locks, and ensuring Amara's safety. The anonymous threats weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. Nadine took on the role of protector, staying with the Johnsons and helping with Amara, while Teresa worked with Marcus and Cheryl. One evening, as Nadine was tucking Amara into bed, the little girl asked a question that left her aunt momentarily speechless. "Auntie Nadine," Amara whispered, "what if Mom gets hurt because of me?" Nadine knelt beside her niece, her expression softening. "Sweetheart, your mom is fighting because she loves you, and because she wants the world to be a better place for you and everyone else. Don't ever think this is your fault, okay?" Amara nodded, but the worry lingered in her eyes. Meanwhile, Marcus had uncovered another critical piece of the puzzle: emails between Dr. Harris and a now-defunct consulting firm that suggested kickbacks in exchange for inflated contracts. The emails, though indirect, were enough to raise serious questions about his integrity. "Teresa, this is our smoking gun," Marcus said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "If we present this at the meeting, they'll have no choice but to investigate." Teresa's relief was palpable, but Marcus cautioned her. "This will make things messy. Dr. Harris has powerful connections, and he won't go down without a fight." Cheryl Goodman was also busy rallying former teachers and parents who had been affected by the school's toxic environment. At one meeting, she introduced Teresa to Angela Perez, a Latina mother whose son had been suspended for speaking Spanish in class. They called it disruptive behavior, Angela said bitterly. But it was just prejudice, plain and simple. I've been waiting for a chance to speak out. Teresa felt a kinship with Angela. Together, they planned to highlight the broader pattern of discrimination that had been swept under the rug for years. Amara, too, found herself connecting with others in unexpected ways. One afternoon, a shy boy named Ravi approached her during lunch. "I heard what happened to you," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I think you're really brave." Amara smiled, her spirits lifting slightly. "Thanks. It's been hard, but my mom says it's important to stand up for what's right." Ravi hesitated before speaking again. "My teacher once told me my food smelled bad, and everyone laughed. I didn't tell anyone, though. I just stopped bringing it." Amara's heart sank. "That's not fair," she said. "You should bring whatever you want. It's your food, it's part of who you are." Their conversation sparked something in Amara. She decided to create a poster for her classroom, filled with affirmations about celebrating differences. With her teacher's permission, it was displayed near the door, serving as a small but meaningful reminder to her peers. As the day of the meeting approached, tensions continued to rise. Teresa received a call from Pastor Miller, who had been coordinating the community forum. "There's been talk of counter-protests," he warned. "Some people think this whole thing is an attack on the town's traditions." "Traditions?" Teresa said, her voice sharp. "Since when is discrimination a tradition worth defending?" Pastor Miller sighed. "You're right, of course. But fear makes people cling to the past, even when it's harmful. Stay strong, Teresa. You have more support than you realize." On the morning of the meeting, the Johnsons were met with an unexpected show of solidarity. Dozens of community members, many holding signs with messages like "Justice for Amara" and "End the Silence," gathered outside their home to walk with them to the school. Among them were Angela Perez, Cheryl Goodman, and even Ravi and his parents. As they approached the school, Teresa felt a swell of emotion. The crowd had grown larger than she'd anticipated, with people from neighboring towns joining to support the cause. But as they entered the auditorium, the opposing side was impossible to ignore. A smaller group, led by Mrs. Beecham's staunchest defenders, stood at the back, their signs reading, "Support our teachers," and "Stop dividing us." Teresa squared her shoulders, holding Amara's hand tightly. She had prepared for this moment, but the weight of it all was overwhelming. The meeting was about to begin, and Teresa knew the fight for justice was reaching its climax. The evidence was strong, the voices were louder than ever, but the opposition was relentless. Would the board finally take responsibility, or would they double down on their resistance? The school board meeting began with a palpable sense of tension filling the packed auditorium. Dr. Harris sat at the center of the long table, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying unease. To his right were the other board members, their postures stiff as they prepared for what was shaping up to be the most contentious meeting in the school's history. Teresa sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Amara sat beside her, her small shoulders squared with quiet determination. Behind them, a sea of supporters filled the seats, their presence a reminder of the stakes. On the other side of the room, Mrs. Beecham's allies whispered amongst themselves, their expressions a mix of anger and defiance. The meeting opened with procedural formalities, but it wasn't long before the floor was opened for public comments. Cheryl Goodman was the first to speak. She approached the podium with a folder of documents and a determined look on her face. "For years, this school has failed its students by allowing discrimination to go unchecked," she began. "I left because I couldn't stand by and watch it continue. But tonight, I'm here to make sure the truth is heard." She presented her testimony with precision, recounting her experiences and highlighting specific instances where complaints about Mrs. Beecham had been ignored or dismissed. Cheryl ended by holding up a copy of the leaked emails Marcus had discovered. "These aren't just isolated incidents. They're part of a larger pattern of negligence that starts at the top." The crowd erupted into applause, though it was quickly silenced by Dr. Harris, who banged his gavel. "Let's maintain order," he said, his voice taut. Next, Angela Perez approached the podium. She spoke passionately about her son's suspension for speaking Spanish in class, her voice trembling with emotion. "My son's heritage isn't a disruption," she said, glaring at the board. "It's part of who he is. And it's your responsibility to make sure every child feels safe and valued." As speaker after speaker shared their stories, the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Harris maintained his composed demeanor, but Teresa noticed his hand gripping his pen tightly. Finally, it was Teresa's turn. She stood and walked to the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. She placed her notes on the stand, but didn't look at them. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "When my daughter came home that day, crying because her teacher cut her hair without her consent, it broke something in me," she began. "It wasn't just about the hair. It was about the message it sent, that who she is wasn't good enough. That's not a message any child should hear." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "But this isn't just about Amara. It's about every child who's been made to feel less than, every parent who's been ignored, and every teacher who's been silenced. We deserve better." The room was silent for a moment before applause broke out, louder this time. Teresa returned to her seat, her heart pounding. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, his face a mask of calm as he addressed the audience. "We appreciate the feedback from our community," he said. "I want to assure everyone that the board takes these concerns seriously. However, I must remind you that some of these allegations are unsubstantiated and frankly defamatory." Murmurs of dissent rippled through the crowd, but Dr. Harris continued. "Mrs. Beecham has served the school with dedication for over 2 decades. While her actions are under review, we must remember the importance of due process." Teresa felt her anger rising, but before she could respond, Marcus stood up. "May I approach the podium?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Dr. Harris hesitated before nodding. Marcus strode to the front with the confidence of someone holding all the cards. He held up a folder. "These are financial records from the past 5 years," he began. "They show a pattern of misuse of funds allocated for diversity training programs, and the payments lead back to a consulting firm owned by none other than Dr. Arthur Harris." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Dr. Harris's face flushed, his composure slipping for the first time. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "These documents don't prove anything. They prove enough to warrant an investigation," Marcus countered. "And as an attorney, I've already filed a formal complaint with the state education department. The community deserves answers, Dr. Harris, not excuses." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Marcus returned to his seat. Dr. Harris tried to regain control, but the crowd was no longer on his side. Teresa glanced at Amara, who gave her a small, hopeful smile. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. But as the meeting drew to a close, Teresa knew the battle was far from over. The board had been backed into a corner, but whether they would act or retaliate remained to be seen. The fallout from the school board meeting rippled through the town like an earthquake. By the following morning, the revelation of Dr. Harris's involvement in the financial scandal dominated local headlines. Social media buzzed with heated debates, and the regional news picked up the story, putting Willow Creek in an unflattering spotlight. For Teresa, it was a bittersweet victory. The public outrage was growing, but so was the backlash. Dr. Harris's allies scrambled to discredit Marcus's findings, while Mrs. Beecham's defenders doubled down on their accusations that the Johnsons were ruining lives for attention. Despite the noise, Teresa pressed forward. Marcus had arranged a meeting with state education officials to discuss their findings, and Cheryl Goodman had rallied a coalition of former teachers and parents to demand a full audit of the school's policies and finances. The pressure was mounting, but so was the resistance. One afternoon, as Teresa picked Amara up from school, she was confronted by a small group of parents in the parking lot. "You're destroying this community," one woman said, her voice sharp. "My kids loved Mrs. Beecham. What gives you the right to drag her through the mud?" Teresa met the woman's glare with quiet strength. "What gives me the right? The fact that my daughter was humiliated in front of her peers. The fact that this school has ignored these issues for years. That's what gives me the right, another parent, a man with a defensive posture, scoffed. You're making this about race. Not everything is about that, Teresa's patience snapped. It's about respect, she said, her voice rising. Respect for my daughter, for your children, for every kid who walks through those doors expecting to feel safe and valued. If you can't see that, then maybe you're part of the problem. The confrontation left Teresa shaken but resolute. That evening, as she sat with Marcus and Cheryl to finalize their next steps, she received a text from Pastor Miller. Be careful. I've heard some of Dr. Harris's allies are trying to escalate things. What does he mean by escalate? Teresa asked, showing Marcus the message. Marcus frowned. It could mean anything: intimidation, counter lawsuits, even digging into your past to discredit you. Are you ready for that? Teresa took a deep breath. I have to be. If we stop now, they win. Meanwhile, Dr. Harris was fighting to save his reputation. He called an emergency press conference to deny the allegations, flanked by his attorney and a few loyal board members. These accusations are baseless, he said, his voice filled with indignation. I have served this community with integrity for decades. This smear campaign is nothing more than a distraction from the real issues at hand. But his defiance was undermined by the growing list of former teachers and parents coming forward with their stories. Each new testimony added weight to the case against him and the culture of neglect he had overseen. The turning point came when the state education department announced they would send investigators to Willow Creek. The school board, now under intense scrutiny, scheduled another emergency meeting to address the mounting pressure. The night of the meeting, the auditorium was filled to capacity. Dr. Harris sat at the head of the table, his confident facade beginning to crack. Teresa and Marcus sat in the front row, armed with their evidence, and supported by a crowd of parents, teachers, and activists. The tension reached its peak when Dr. Harris's attorney stood to speak. These allegations are an insult to the integrity of this board, he began, his tone sharp. We will not allow unfounded accusations to derail the important work we do for this community. Marcus rose in response, his voice calm but commanding. Integrity? Let's talk about integrity. Because what I have here, emails, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses, paints a very different picture. He presented the evidence piece by piece, each revelation landing like a blow. The audience watched in stunned silence as the case against Dr. Harris unfolded. Finally, Teresa stood to address the board directly. We're not here to destroy anyone's reputation, she said. We're here to demand accountability, because our children deserve better. And if you can't see that, then you don't deserve to lead this community. Her words were met with thunderous applause, leaving Dr. Harris visibly shaken. The meeting ended with the board voting to place Dr. Harris on administrative leave pending the state investigation. Mrs. Beecham's suspension was extended, and the board announced plans to review the school's policies with input from parents and community leaders. For Teresa, it was a hard-fought victory, but she knew it wasn't the end. The system had been cracked open, but true change would require vigilance, unity, and relentless effort. That night, as she and Amara walked home under the falling snow, Amara looked up at her mother with a small smile. You did it, Mom, she said. We did it, Teresa replied, pulling her daughter close. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Teresa felt the warmth of hope. The fallout from the school board meeting set Willow Creek ablaze with activity and emotion. While many celebrated the board's decision to place Dr. Harris on leave and extend Mrs. Beecham's suspension, others were furious, their resentment bubbling to the surface in new and unexpected ways. For Teresa, the victory was bittersweet. She had achieved a crucial milestone, but the fight wasn't over. Dr. Harris's allies were still active, and whispers of a potential lawsuit against her for defamation and slander persisted. The tension weighed heavily on her, especially as Amara prepared to return to school. I'll be okay, Mom, Amara said, trying to reassure her. I can handle it. Teresa hugged her daughter tightly. You shouldn't have to handle it, baby, but I'm proud of you for being so brave. The first day back at school was challenging for Amara. While some of her classmates greeted her warmly, others avoided her. their parents' opinions influencing their behavior. A few even muttered cruel comments under their breath. "Troublemaker," one boy said as she walked by. Amara's cheeks burned, but she held her head high, determined not to let their words break her. Later that day, she found comfort in a surprising place. Ravi and a small group of classmates who invited her to sit with them at lunch. "My mom says what happened to you is really unfair," Ravi said, "and she's glad you're standing up to them." Amara smiled, her spirits lifting. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of normalcy returning. Meanwhile, Teresa was facing her own challenges. The increased media attention brought both support and criticism. A national news outlet requested an interview, but Marcus cautioned her against it. "They're looking for drama," he said. "If you want to tell your story, we need to find the right platform." Despite the external pressures, Teresa remained focused on the bigger picture. She continued to work with Cheryl and Angela to build a coalition of parents advocating for systemic change. They drafted a proposal outlining new policies for the school district, including mandatory diversity training, stronger anti-bullying measures, and an oversight committee to address complaints. But as the group gained momentum, they encountered resistance. A faction of parents and board members pushed back, arguing that the proposed changes were too radical and unnecessary. One evening, Teresa received an anonymous email accusing her of tearing apart the fabric of the community. It included a thinly veiled threat: "You're making enemies you don't want. Stop before it's too late." Teresa forwarded the message to Marcus and the local police, but felt the weight of it deeply. That night, she sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames as Nadine joined her. "You've come so far, sis," Nadine said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't let them scare you now." "I'm not scared for me," Teresa admitted. "I'm scared for Amara. She's already been through so much. What if this just makes her life harder?" Nadine shook her head. "You're teaching her how to fight for what's right. That's the best gift you can give her." As the weeks passed, the state investigators began their work, interviewing teachers, parents, and board members. The pressure on Dr. Harris and his allies intensified as more evidence of financial misconduct came to light. Meanwhile, the school board, under mounting scrutiny, scheduled a final meeting to vote on the proposed reforms and decide the fate of Mrs. Beecham. The night before the meeting, Teresa gathered her closest supporters at her home. Marcus reviewed their presentation one last time, while Cheryl and Angela rehearsed their statements. Amara sat quietly at the kitchen table, working on a handmade sign that read, "Every student matters." As the snow fell outside, Teresa felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. She knew the next day could mark a turning point, not just for her family, but for the entire community. The night of the final school board meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Snow blanketed Willow Creek, muffling the sounds of the town, but inside the packed auditorium, every murmur and shuffled paper felt amplified. The stakes had never been higher. This was more than a meeting, it was a reckoning. Teresa sat with Amara beside her, holding the handmade sign that read, "Every student matters." Behind them were dozens of parents, teachers, and students who had come to show their support. Across the room, a smaller but vocal group of Mrs. Beecham's defenders sat in tight clusters, their expressions ranging from defiant to nervous. At the center of the stage sat the school board, now noticeably divided. Dr. Harris's usual air of authority was gone, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. His attorney whispered in his ear, their conversation tense and hurried. The meeting began with Dr. Harris reading a prepared statement. His tone was calm, but tinged with desperation. "I deeply regret that this situation has caused such division in our community," he said. "While mistakes may have been made, I assure you that I have always acted in the best interest of our schools." The crowd's reaction was immediate, a mix of scoffs and murmurs. Teresa's jaw tightened. She knew this was his attempt to deflect responsibility. Next, it was Marcus's turn. He stood confidently and approached the podium, his presence commanding the room's attention. "Over the past several weeks, we've uncovered evidence of systemic failures in this district, failures that have harmed students and violated the public's trust," Marcus began. "Tonight, we're here to demand accountability, transparency, and meaningful change." He presented the financial records and emails tying Dr. Harris to the misused funds, carefully walking the audience through the evidence. Each point landed like a hammer blow, leaving the board visibly unsettled. Cheryl Goodman followed, sharing stories from her years at the school and emphasizing how the toxic environment had driven her and other teachers away. Her voice cracked with emotion as she concluded. "This isn't about revenge," she said. "It's about ensuring that every child, regardless of their background, feels safe, valued, and supported in our schools." Finally, Teresa approached the podium. She glanced at Amara, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Teresa began to speak. "When my daughter came home crying that day, I didn't just see her pain, I saw the pain of every child who's ever been told they don't belong," she said. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And that starts with holding people accountable and ensuring that this never happens again." The audience erupted into applause, but Teresa wasn't finished. She turned to the board, her gaze steady. "You have a choice tonight. You can defend the status quo, or you can stand with the students and families you're supposed to serve. What kind of legacy do you want to leave?" Dr. Harris looked visibly shaken, his confidence unraveling under the weight of the evidence and the community's outrage. He leaned over to his attorney, who whispered something in his ear. As the board deliberated, the tension in the room was unbearable. Finally, the chairwoman who had replaced Dr. Harris as acting head stood to deliver the results. After careful consideration, she began. "The board has voted unanimously to terminate Mrs. Beecham's employment and to recommend a full investigation into the financial practices of this district, including the actions of Dr. Harris." The room erupted into cheers and applause. Teresa felt a wave of relief wash over her as Amara squeezed her hand. But the chairwoman wasn't finished. "We are also implementing immediate reforms, including mandatory diversity training for all staff and the creation of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints. This is only the beginning, but it's a necessary step toward rebuilding trust in our schools." As the meeting adjourned, supporters flooded Teresa and Amara with hugs and words of encouragement. Even strangers approached to thank them for their courage. Outside, under the softly falling snow, Teresa held Amara close. "Mom," Amara said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "We did it." Teresa smiled, tears streaming down her face. "No, baby, you did it. You were the spark that lit this fire. And because of you, things are going to change." As they walked home, Teresa reflected on how far they had come. The fight had been grueling, but it had also brought the community together in ways she never imagined. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time, the future felt bright. The days following the school board's decision felt like a new beginning for Willow Creek. The tension that had gripped the town began to thaw, replaced by a cautious optimism. While the wounds of the fight were still fresh, there was a sense that the community had turned a corner. Dr. Harris resigned from his position shortly after the state investigators began their inquiry, citing personal reasons. His departure marked the end of an era, but it also left a vacuum that the town was determined to fill with better leadership. The Oversight Committee, composed of parents, teachers, and community leaders, began to take shape, with Cheryl Goodman and Angela Perez among its founding members. For Teresa, life slowly began to return to normal. The media attention waned, and she was finally able to focus on her family without the constant fear of retaliation. Amara settled back into school, finding comfort in a growing circle of supportive friends. Her teacher, now more attuned to the importance of inclusivity, incorporated lessons celebrating different cultures and histories, a small but meaningful step toward healing. One afternoon, Teresa and Amara were invited to speak at a local community center, where a group of parents and educators had gathered to discuss ways to implement the reforms across the district. Amara, now more confident than ever, took the microphone and shared her story. "When my teacher cut my hair, I felt like I didn't matter," she said. "But my mom taught me that I do matter, and that we all matter. We shouldn't be afraid to be ourselves, and we shouldn't let anyone make us feel small. Her words were met with a standing ovation. Teresa watched with pride, marveling at how much her daughter had grown through the ordeal. As they left the event, Pastor Miller approached Teresa with a warm smile. "You've started something powerful here," he said. "This town will never be the same, and that's a good thing." "It wasn't just me," Teresa replied. "It was everyone who stood up, who refused to stay silent. Change takes all of us." That evening, as Teresa and Amara decorated their home for the new year, Nadine joined them, laughing as she strung lights around the fireplace. They reflected on the journey they had been through, the challenges, the victories, and the bonds it had strengthened. "Do you think it's over now?" Nadine asked, her tone curious. Teresa shook her head, her gaze thoughtful. "No, but it's a start. And that's enough for now." Amara placed a star on top of the small Christmas tree they had kept up as a reminder of the season's lessons. She turned to her mother, her face lit with joy. "Mom," she said, "this feels like a happy ending." Teresa knelt beside her daughter and hugged her tightly. "It's a happy beginning, sweetheart, and we'll make the rest of the story together." The story of Teresa and Amara reminds us of the power of courage, love, and unity in the face of injustice. It's a testament to the change that can happen when communities come together and demand better. If you found inspiration in their journey, remember to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and hope. Share this story with others who believe in standing up for what's right, and check out our next video to learn more about how you can make a difference in your own community. Together, we can build a world where every voice matters.